So let's talk a little bit about something we've talked about before, which is some of the vulnerabilities that are created by being from a narcissistic family system. The question that comes up for a lot of folks is, am I a target for narcissistic people, or am I doing something to attract them? And my answer to these people in most cases, almost always, is no. The narcissistic person is attracted to you because you're attractive to them. You're attracted to them because they're attractive in some way to you, and probably to a lot of people. And you specifically are not a target for them because of some weakness in you. This idea that some people are just narcissist bait, not so much. I do think that the tide may turn as people start understanding narcissism more, and my hope is that there is a new group of folks out there who start seeing some of these patterns early. But in general, I don't know that there's any group that has some kind of inherent weakness that makes it more likely that they will get pulled in. However, I do have to say, people who might have sort of high social status, money, a certain kind of appearance, they may be quite attractive to narcissistic people. But after we get past the point of who's attracted to whom in the early phase of a relationship, all of this stops being simple. Now, if you're from a narcissistic family system, you're at much greater risk for getting stuck in one of these relationships, and maybe even a little more vulnerable to narcissistic people. A theme that has come up in conversations with hundreds of people who grew up in narcissistic family systems that subsequently ended up in narcissistic relationships in adulthood, especially when it came to romantic relationships, but even in close friendships, is that they found a tremendous comfort in being desired, in being wanted, and frankly, with someone almost being consumed about being with them. So that means that when unhealthy patterns emerge alongside that, like excessive contact, constant texting, and expectations of quick responses back, or regular calls or video calls, or just always wanting to spend time, or expecting you to be available all the time, when those arise, those demands may not get logged as unhealthy or encroaching, but instead maybe as somewhat comforting. People who felt this way told me, they're like, there was no question in my mind that this person was interested in me or wanted to be with me, because it was so all-encompassing. And that felt reassuring to them. And they would go on to say that I didn't question this person's interest in me because of how all-consuming it was for them. But if this had been a person where maybe when they were texting me, there were more pauses in the texting, or they weren't obsessively trying to stay in touch with me, or sometimes did their own thing, or they weren't sort of over the top, I would then have doubted their commitment, and I would have assumed they weren't interested in me, or that I wasn't attractive in some way to them. And I'm no doubt that some of you might resonate with this. This dynamic of wanting, of being reassured by lots of evidence of interest by someone, can be something that sets a person up for missing the red flags of this overly intense focus. I am sure that some of you are thinking, isn't that normal early in a relationship, kind of being obsessed and wanting to stay in touch all the time? Not really. It's not healthy, and it can lead the relationship and this new person to rather quickly overtake your life. And when this happens, if there are any toxic dynamics afoot, the loss of individuation can happen fast and furious. And for folks whom this kind of overwhelming dynamic is reassuring because of vulnerabilities created by early life dynamics, it can be really problematic. This reassurance by this all-in feeling can lead a person to fight for a relationship where all of this intense interest and time together and always being available to them is occurring. And that's when a second thing happens. Because if you had even one narcissistic, antagonistic, or really inconsistently available parent, you learned one thing for sure, that your you doesn't matter. The household and the family were run solely on what worked for the narcissistic parent. Schedules, time, interest, where you lived, how you lived, what you did, and everyone adapted because you had little choice in the matter, certainly as a child. You learned that love, whatever the hell that means, meant that you silenced yourself and went all in on what the other person, in these earliest cases in your life, the parent, wanted, again, because you didn't have a choice. It may mean that you might have even taken on interests that the narcissistic parent had with the hope that if you did that or were good at these things, that then maybe they would notice you. Or that you would try to be as helpful as possible to the narcissistic parent. Or that you were as little trouble as possible to the narcissistic parent or the family, just making yourself invisible. Or you were never a problem, or you're going along to get along all the time. If you were the golden child, you may have known that you were on a perilous pedestal that could go away as soon as you didn't show up the way that they wanted, or you felt guilt and shame at getting better treatment while others around you weren't, and none of it really made sense. You learned that your interests, opinions, beliefs did not matter, and that love meant that you had to, in essence, sort of, give in or capitulate to the person who had the power. I don't even know if capitulate is the right word, because that still feels like something you're consciously doing. But rather, love meant that you just became what the other person wanted and couldn't show up as just you. Well, needless to say, this setup is a disaster in adult relationships, because not only could it mean that there is a greater vulnerability to a person who early in a relationship is sort of obsessive with their interest, but there is a risk that in a million subtle ways that you give in to what the other person wants in a new relationship. And it doesn't happen overnight. You may slowly give up on things that matter to you, friendships, interests, other activities. You may slowly take on the interests of the other person, even though they hold little, they're not very compelling to you. You may find yourself no longer fighting for your values or beliefs and either not voicing them or, in more extreme cases, starting to take on the beliefs of this new person in your life. When you grow up in a narcissistic family, love means the abandonment of the self. And if this does not get addressed before you enter adult relationships, and in most cases it doesn't, since most people start dating in their adolescences and early adulthood and are not at a time they can process what the narcissistic family system was, but this means friendships, romantic relationships, all mean significant self-sacrifice, becoming what the other person wants in order for the relationship to sustain. And then that signature of all narcissistic relationships, self-abandonment, as well as subjugation, become the rule of the relationship. By then, most people are so deep in, confused by trauma bonding, both the past and present trauma bonding, and all the practical stuff that keeps you stuck in these relationships, that it feels so difficult to be able to pull yourself out. The challenge with all of this is that it is so programmed and it is so subtle that we are not aware we are doing it. And there's also the fear of folks who are in these situations, the sense that if I do not fully go along and do everything, then it's going to be my fault if this relationship doesn't work out. They were so into me. You may think like, if this doesn't work, it's because I'm the one who's not being flexible. The problem is that when we completely give in, this relationship may last, but then we slowly feel sick and don't understand why that is. And then when you do try to be you and show up as you in the relationship, well, that's not going to work. And that's when your eyes open and you realize, I'm really stuck and really confused. In an ideal world, folks that grow up in narcissistic family systems would have access to therapy at a young enough age that helps them understand these patterns before they start dating. But that's not likely to happen at a population-wide level. Though I must say I am seeing more and more young people get educated about all of this, which is a good thing. Because then, while there may be literally a sort of physical, somatic comfort in someone being sort of obsessed with you, that you can also take a step back and recognize that this comfort is also a tricky sensation. This is a tough one. We're fed these bullshit fairy tales and films that push the idea of obsession as being a normal place for a relationship to begin. And we do not do enough teaching to folks on what constitutes a healthy relationship. Then, adding insult to injury, given our past histories, we are often not equipped to make optimal relationship decisions. We make them anyhow, and society somehow wants us to pay forever for these errors in judgment because we didn't know how to make these decisions and then get guidance on how to make it work and fight for the relationship and all the BS about relationships just being about sacrifice. Here's the thing. Slow often wins the race in healthy relationships. Always being sure that you take time to listen to yourself, ensuring that you get to maintain whatever sense of self you have in a relationship. And it can be very challenging when the very opportunity to create a sense of self was never there in the first place, or the sense that you are wrecking the chance for a relationship with someone who's so into you by just being you. Cutting your losses early is often the best strategy in any kind of antagonistic relationship, but that means understanding all of these dynamics well so you don't get too far down the toxic river that you can't paddle upstream again and take yourself back. And a key thing to remember is you can't paddle this boat alone. This is why we need other people around us to talk things out with, to have sounding boards, to have people who will validate our reality and really hear us. And ideally, you got a few narcissism-informed friends who can hear it. And especially when you say, something here doesn't fit, they're so into me, but that they don't say, no, it'll be fine, but can say, okay, talk about it. Because many times, and I talk to anyone who's ever been through a narcissistic relationship, they'll say, no matter how messed up my family was, I still knew something wasn't right here. But I was so programmed for this that even when I questioned it, I just assumed that this was something that was wrong with me. Your intuition in these situations is a lot better than you think, but that soothing, that filling of that core wound of somebody who's so deeply into you, and then feeling that you're going to blow it up by being you, it's a very common issue that can get people stuck in narcissistic relationships, especially if you had early relationships characterized by these personality patterns. I hope that's helpful, and thanks again.